Hello, this is Monica Volkmar, and I have a gait analysis with Esther to share today. So I don't know much about Esther other than a few of her complaints. One of her complaints is her right hamstring, her outer right foot, and her outer left knee. So we're going to take a look first at her static alignment and then a gait video and just see what we see. So why don't we take a look at her standing from a front view. See if anything big stands out that might tell us a little bit about why she's experiencing her current symptoms. And this is my first time taking a look at this, so I have no idea what to expect. What first stands out to me as it relates to her left knee is that it looks like she has a touch more of a valgus type of shape in her left knee. You can see her tibia angled a little bit more in a bit more medially. Often what a valgus knee will tell us is that there is a internal rotation present at her femur. What this will do to the outside of her left knee is create a more closed, compressed position. And I wonder if that's the sensation she's experiencing there. So we'll park that thought for now. But what could be the case is that we need to look at, can her left knee extend and internally rotate from the position that it looks like it's trapped in this valgus shape. But moving on. From the front view, it looks like her right shoulder is lower than her left shoulder. So we might be seeing a bit of a lateral flexion of her spine to the right. We'll have to look at her back to be a bit more clear about that. You can see her right hand a little bit lower than her left hand. So that's a clue there as well. You zoom in on both of her feet. It looks as if both of her forefeet or mid feet, they look like they have a little bit of a high-ish arch, which doesn't necessarily mean her feet are both supinated. But we also see a little bit of a kind of valgus big toe on both sides, but in particular on the left side. All right, I'd like to look at a different angle of her body. Let's take a look at her back view. All right. So from the back view, her spine is not super visible underneath her clothing, but what stands out a lot is this right scapula and how it seems it's more visible, this medial border. That medial border being more visible might indicate to us that she has more of a protraction on that right scapula. Now, a protraction of the right scapula, it might mean that her spine is more rotated to the left, as that would create a situation with the spine rotated left where the right scapula would become more protracted and the left more retracted. However, I'm not sure if that's the case here. It's hard to tell because it almost looks like her right arm is behind her body a little bit more. So I'm not really clear if her arm and her spine are coordinated in the way that we would like them to go for a comfortable body. I'll say more about that if I need to, but if we zoom in on her pelvis a little bit. From the back view, are we seeing a frontal plane, like a hike or a drop in her pelvis? And it's tough to say. It looks relatively even to me, even enough that I don't feel like speculating too much about it. From the back view of her feet, we can see that she has a little bit of a more of a turned out right foot. However, both feet rest a little more turned out. So it's hard for me to tell if this calcaneus is rolled more into an eversion than her other calcaneus. But there is a sense, perhaps, that there's something about this foot mechanics that I'd like to know. Is she turning out her foot to perhaps put a more inverted forefoot on the ground? Tough to say. From the back view, it also almost looks like her right knee is the one that's more valgus. So I'm not sure if that's just a glitch in how she was standing, that she's standing a little bit differently in the front to the back, or if I am just going crazy. Anyway, let's take a look at a side view and just see if there's anything stand out here that gives us some information. So from a left side view, what stands out a little bit is some what looks like rigidity in her, or stiffness, tension in her neck. It looks like her head is either she is pulling it back forcefully, it's hard to say with just a static image, but it doesn't look like a relaxed shape of her neck there. A nice thing to look at from the side is if there is any kind of rotation in the rib cage, we'd see more of the front of her body facing us. So from the left side view, we don't really see a lot of her upper body, her sternum bone. And I wonder if from a right side view, that's interesting. So we see more of her sternum, more of her actual skin of her sternum on this side. So this kind of leads me back to my confusion. If we go back to the beginning of her back view, where I was wondering about her protracted scapula, and normally what that would give us at rest is if a spine is rotated to the left, then we'd have a left scapula that is retracted. Whoops. And a right scapula that is protracted. However, for her, what it seems like is she has a right rotation of her spine and a more protracted scapula on the right. So what this might mean is that in her gait, when she swings her right arm back into an extension and accesses a rotation to the right of her spine, that might be the dominant thing she's able to do. If she can get her right arm back into extension more easily and her left arm forward into flexion more easily, and this is a top view of her body, and this is the left arm, this is the right arm, this is their nose, then they're going to be able to put their right foot forward and their left foot back more easily. This is supposed to be a foot, a right foot, and this is a left foot. So what I might predict about Esther's gait is that she's better at accessing a right leg forward phase. So that could be her heel strike phase or her suspension phase, perhaps. Well, what's interesting about that, I'll just put her into a side view again. So let's say this is what she can access more, right leg forward and a left leg back. What that will do to the tissue of the right hamstring is it will create a length with that flexion of her hip. So an interesting question could be, why might her body be organized in such a way that she's better at stepping forward with the right leg, and with every step putting a bit more length into that right hamstring? And with hamstring strains, I'm not sure if she had a hamstring strain or if that's just where she has the discomfort. I forget now what I read. Oops. But often it is a eccentric load that is the mechanical thing that causes a muscle to get strained. Not because it's too short and needs to be stretched, but because it's too long and can't unload. And remember, that eccentric load creates the most demand on the muscle. It feels the most unsafe for a muscle, and it produces the most amount of force that a muscle can produce from that long state. So it can be quite a mechanism of creating a potential strain. All right. Anyway, so the biggest standout really for me was her spine rotation right and that scapula protraction on the right. So I'm not really sure what her injury history is, but I'd be curious if there's anything in her upper body, perhaps, that is causing the trouble below, or if there's been anything in her lower body that is causing the distortion above. A sip of coffee before we move on to her gait video. Caffeine. All right. And I'm sure there's other stuff I could mention there, but for the sake of time, it's already been like 12 minutes. Let's move on. So here's her gait video. Let's watch it real time speed first and see if anything big stands out. Without sounding overly judgmental, it looks as if she is just quite rigid through her hips and that there's not a lot of movement. I am noticing a rotation of her entire body to the right. So ribcage and pelvis both seem to rotate more easily to her right than to her left. Right rotation. Right rotation. Right rotation. That was all we got. Watch that one more time. So you can see when she swings her right leg forward, her spine rotates to the right, but also when her right leg goes forward, she doesn't rotate her pelvis to the left like she does when her left foot goes forward. Sorry, I said that wrong. When her left foot goes forward, her pelvis is rotating right. That's what we want to see. But when her right leg goes forward, her pelvis doesn't rotate left. Now, because that is kind of interesting for us, based on some of her symptoms, let's just put her into a phase. So we're going to go phase by phase. Why don't we start with her right heel strike? So we'll get her 1, 2, 3 steps in, and right heel strike. So when her right leg swings forward, we know she's kind of set up with her upper body to do that. What we'd like to see happening is that when her right foot is forward, right leg is forward, the pelvis would have a rotation to the left and the ribcage a rotation to the right. We'd have opposition between those two structures. What we can see is that her pelvis does not rotate to the left. So if we're making a list of things that are missing, left pelvis rotation would be one of them. If she stands with her pelvis rotated to the right and moves with her pelvis only rotating to the right, what it will do to her right hip is create an excessive amount of internal rotation. When the leg swings forward in gait in our flow motion model, we never really want to see it in front of the body, prepared to receive our mass with an internal rotation. So this could be one thing that is potentially creating a bit of strain on her hamstring. I don't know if it was the lateral or medial hamstring, but that internal rotation with a flexing hip is not going to be a happy situation. All right. If we compare that to her other heel strike, left heel strike, what's interesting is she lands in that left heel strike with a bit of an E version in her calcaneus. So that isn't ideal either. We'd like to see her contact point be posterior lateral with an inverted calcaneus. This kind of goes back to what I saw initially with her static alignment, where she had a bit of a valgus in that knee. A valgus knee would be a more internal rotation of the femur and create a bit more of an eversion in the foot shape. And that looks like what we're seeing as she lands on her heel here. So neither heel strike is very ideal. What this would create at her knee on the left, which she has some complaints in, is that valgus shape and a sense of closure, so a compression on the lateral knee. What was it like on her right side? Yeah, she's more landing with a slightly more inverted calcaneus and a less of a valgus in her right knee compared to her left. All right. What's interesting here as well, watching the journey of getting onto her right leg, is she doesn't really seem to shift her pelvis to the right, which is what we'd like to see. As she's going into her right heel strike, we'd like to see her mass traveling towards the front leg to adduct the hip. When she goes to the left, there's a sense of a bit more of a left shift of the pelvis. So almost as if she's a bit better at adducting. Can you see that right there? A little bit more of a swing into her left leg, which can lead us into her next phase, which would be after heel strike comes suspension. She's already landing in her heel strike with a bit of an eversion in her calcaneus. So her foot may pronate quite quickly. We'll put her into where her foot looks like it's finished moving into pronation and all the toes appear to be down. So I'm going to say right about there. And there's that nice valgus of the knee, which you want to see in a suspension phase, as well as you want to see that hike of the pelvis. What's interesting, however, is we still see that shape of her spine that looks to be in more of a right lateral flexion. And in the suspension phase, ideally, we ought to see a left lateral flexion to get her mass fully on top of her left leg. So she's still holding this shape of her spine, a right lateral flexion, which was in her static alignment. All right. Moving on from, if we back up, so moving back. Right heel strike. What does her right suspension look like? How's the quality of her right foot pronation? If we get her into the place where it looks like she's finished pronating, well, interestingly, I don't think she even ever starts pronating that foot. Look at the angle of that calcaneus. It looks like she lands with an inverted foot here. And does that shape of this Achilles here ever go like that? I don't think it does. So she appears to have a little bit more of an inversion of the calcaneus throughout her pronation, which might indicate or might explain a little bit the discomfort on the lateral border of her right foot this would be, I should use a green to show that this would be a little bit of a eccentric load, a bit of a stretch there. And that might not be too pleasant, so think potential mechanism of ankle sprain territory. So a bit more of an inversion on that foot. So I could perhaps ask Esther the question, did you sprain that ankle and is it still holding that shape? And does your body not want to put your mass over it with your actual center of mass, which is roughly there, L4, L5-ish? If we watch her go into that suspension and we take a representation of her center of mass and draw it down roughly to the floor. So she's not fully getting her pelvis over her right foot to adduct her hip on the right. But on the left, let's see if that's a bit different. So if you take her center of mass and not quite centered, it's not going to be perfect. But it looks like her center of mass is actually a little bit more over the middle of her foot. So her actual pelvis moves to the left. Ooh, trying to draw a smiley face. But when she's on her right leg, oh, that's the step where she turns around. So I'll take her back to this one. She's on her right leg. She doesn't quite get her mass over there. So what stands out as quite missing for her is an adduction of her right hip. Oh, adduction. An external rotation of her right hip and a pronation of her right foot. And all of those occur in a right suspension phase. Very interesting. But what she is doing, well, you could say as part of a right suspension is she has her upper body rotating to the right and laterally flexing to the right. So it's as if her upper body is doing suspension mechanics, but her pelvis and lower body are not able to perform those mechanics. Now, just as a little thing, because I'm going to watch this fast or regular speed again, just to watch the length of her stride. Yeah, because in the beginning, my suspicion was that based on her upper body, that she might have a longer, or not a longer, but a more ability to get her right leg forward based on her transverse plane. And you can kind of see she takes a longer step with her right leg. So she is actually, if you watch front view, she's actually flexing her right hip more. Watch the distance between foot to foot, left leg forward versus right leg forward. So she's got ample flexion of her right hip. Whoa, sorry, wacky zoom in, hip. But that's almost all she's got. She's got a lot of flexion, but she doesn't have the ability to adduct and actually get her mass onto it well. Just flexion. All right. Just because it's interesting to watch from the front view, let's take a look at her suspension on the right to close up. So we can see when her foot comes down on the ground here, there is not a lot of movement in the arch. We'd like to see that arch lowering and becoming more mobile in the entire foot, spreading the foot, lengthening the foot, everting through the calcaneus. And there's not a lot happening. What about her left foot? Also not a lot happening. However, you can see her left knee flexes more, which might explain why, with the position that this leg is in, that greater valgus, why this might become uncomfortable. If she's better at putting her weight onto her left, better at adducting her left hip, and this knee flexes more and has more ability to, well, you could say, quote unquote, pronate, because it's not really a pronation happening well. It's just more of an eversion through that foot. You could see how a lot greater force would be put onto this part of her body than on her right. And even in this phase here, if we go into her left transition phase, what we'd really like to see here is that her knee is extending, her femur is externally rotating, her foot is supinating, but it is not. So she's missing supination on her left foot, and probably we could say entire left leg is missing supination, which would pull her pelvis to the left. And that pelvis rotation to the left would help her right hip experience some external rotation that she needs. Pelvis rotation to the left would also help her access more pronation in this right foot, which we need. More knee flexion. Just check out how little knee flexion she gets here compared to her left side. So if we could put it very broadly, what's missing is a right suspension and pronation mechanics and a left supination, left leg supination, which happens in several phases. And that supination of the leg and foot would also help her to get her mass off of the left and put it into the right. Supination of the left foot would help with a left hip abduction and help her get her pelvis onto her right leg and adduct her right hip. Because it looks like her right hip has a greater range of flexion, which is putting a bit of length and strain into her hamstring there. What would be great is for Esther to also be able to extend that hip and access a left leg forward position. I'd be curious whether when she's getting her left leg forward, she's able to extend this hip well. Often if there's a lot of rotation, so using a lot of transverse plane motion, that might be at the expense of the sagittal plane. So I am curious about the right hip's sagittal plane. Can you extend your right hip and shorten that hamstring, Esther, and put some length into the hip flexor area here? If I were to make any guesses about injury history, I might guess about an ankle sprain here, or even something with either shoulder, just based on that rotation and lateral flexion in her spine. Yeah, so I'm curious if Esther has anything to share about her injury history or if anything resonated with her. Hopefully that was kind of useful to walk through for those of you watching, and hopefully for Esther as well. Thanks for sending me this video. It was pretty fun to look at. Have an awesome day.